In both World Wars and long after, the life expectancy of a tank crewman was measured in minutes. In some battles, more than 80% of crews never survived their first real engagement. These weren't reckless soldiers or poorly trained men. They were victims of physics, design compromises, and the brutal efficiency of modern anti-tank warfare. When tanks first rolled onto the battlefield in 1916, they were seen as invincible machines, steel monsters that could crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and roll through machine gun fire. But early tanks were primitive, slow, and terrifying to operate. The crew sat inside a metal oven with no suspension, surrounded by roaring engines, choking exhaust, and constant heat from the armor plates. Temperatures often reached over 50 degrees Celsius. There were no radios, just shouted commands through the noise and fumes. If the engine backfired, the compartment filled with toxic gas. Some crews lost consciousness before even reaching the front line. When the first shells started hitting them, another weakness became clear. The armor wasn't welded. It was riveted. When enemy rounds struck the surface, red-hot rivets would shear off and ricochet through the cabin like bullets, killing or blinding crew members instantly. The armor that was meant to protect them became one of their worst enemies. Crews learned quickly that being hit didn't always mean being penetrated. It just meant being shredded from the inside. By the Second World War, tanks were faster, better armed, and far more sophisticated, but the problem hadn't changed. Survival rates remained catastrophic. The main cause wasn't bad tactics. It was what happened inside when a shell penetrated. Tank interiors were packed with ammunition and fuel, often stored without any real protection. A single hit could ignite the propellant or rupture the fuel tank, creating a firestorm that filled the compartment in seconds. British crews called it a brew-up. The Americans called it the pop-top. Both meant the same thing. The tank was about to explode. Inside a Sherman or a Panzer, the margin between life and death was measured in seconds. Once the armor was breached, superheated fragments cut through flesh, wiring, and fuel lines. The fumes ignited instantly, and the crew had less than 10 seconds to escape. Most never made it out. The hatches jammed from the shockwave, or the flames simply consumed all oxygen before they could climb free. Survivors often described the smell of burning fuel mixed with human skin, an image so horrific that many never spoke about it after the war. Even if a tank didn't explode, the blast shock could kill everyone inside. The concussive force from a near miss or armor strike rattled brains, ruptured eardrums, and caused internal bleeding. Crewmen who did crawl out were often deaf, disoriented, and burned beyond recognition. It wasn't uncommon to see rescue teams pulling men from smoking wrecks while the ammunition inside continued to cook off. And it wasn't just the design, it was also doctrine. Tank warfare relied heavily on crew coordination and quick reaction times. Yet most new recruits went into battle with minimal training. Wartime production meant tanks were being churned out faster than men could be trained to use them. In 1944, American Sherman crews were sent to Europe after just 4 weeks of instruction. They barely had time to learn how to drive, let alone survive. When they finally faced the experienced Panzer divisions, the results were devastating. This deadly combination of design flaws, fuel volatility, and lack of training meant one thing. Statistically, most tankers never lived to fight twice. The main reason so many tank crews died in their first battle was simple. Once the armor was penetrated, there was nowhere to go. A tank was both protection and prison. The heavy armor that kept bullets out also trapped heat, fire, and smoke inside. When a tank was hit, the blast wave created a vacuum effect. It sucked in air and flames, turning the crew compartment into a furnace in less than 3 seconds. Even if the shell didn't detonate ammunition, the temperature spike alone could melt wiring and ignite hydraulic fluid. Most World War II tanks had little to no insulation. The steel plates conducted heat instantly, and temperatures inside a burning tank could rise past 800 degrees Celsius. Ammunition storage was often exposed, and even a glancing hit could trigger sympathetic detonation. Inside, 75mm and 88mm shells exploded like small bombs. Crewmen rarely had time to react. The commander might open the hatch and push upward, only to be met by the blast wave that hurled him out like debris. German crews faced similar dangers, even in advanced tanks like the Tiger and Panther. While heavily armored, they weren't immune. The fuel lines running through the fighting compartment were a constant hazard. A penetration near the rear engine block could rupture those lines, and in moments the entire crew bay would ignite. Soviet anti-tank rifles, artillery, and later shaped charges made even the thickest armor vulnerable. Reports from the Eastern Front described tanks burning for hours, ammunition detonating intermittently as crews burned alive inside. For the Soviets, it was even worse. The T-34, though revolutionary in design, had almost no interior padding or anti-spall lining. When German shells penetrated, superheated fragments tore through the hull, bouncing between steel walls until nothing inside was left intact. Soviet historians later revealed that entire platoons of T-34 crews were wiped out on their first engagement. In 1943 alone, the Red Army lost over 22,000 tanks. Most crews never saw a second day of combat. The Americans faced their own version of the same problem. The M4 Sherman, nicknamed the Ronson by its own troops after the lighter brand, was notorious for catching fire when hit. Its gasoline engine, combined with poor ammunition storage, made it a death trap. British soldiers fighting alongside American units gave it another nickname, Tommy Cooker, the term German soldiers originally used for burning enemy tanks. Later production runs tried to fix the issue by introducing wet stowage systems, sealing the ammunition racks in protective fluid-filled containers to reduce the risk of detonation. It helped, but not by much. Even escaping wasn't a guarantee of survival. Crews that bailed out were prime targets for machine gun fire or shrapnel. Tankers were often shot while climbing from their hatches or killed by secondary explosions before they hit the ground. Many learned that staying inside meant certain death, but running meant being cut down in the open. Commanders described it as a no-win situation, a steel tomb that could either explode or trap you inside to burn. And yet, despite the horrifying losses, tank crews went back in. Because tanks weren't just weapons, they were mobile fortresses that defined entire battles. Without them, infantry couldn't advance and positions couldn't be held. Nations kept building them, and men kept climbing in, fully aware that statistically they wouldn't survive their first engagement. The terrifying survival rate among tank crews wasn't only about design or armor thickness. It was about doctrine, how nations used their tanks, how they trained their crews, and what they expected them to do once the fighting started. Most armies learned these lessons the hard way through staggering losses. At the start of World War II, every major power had a different idea of what tanks were for. The French treated them as slow-moving support weapons meant to accompany infantry at a walking pace. The Germans, on the other hand, viewed tanks as the centerpiece of fast, coordinated assaults, the backbone of the blitzkrieg. The difference in approach meant the French went into battle with outdated tactics, and their crews were slaughtered. When German panzers advanced through the Ardennes in 1940, entire French tank divisions were destroyed in a matter of days. The crews had strong machines like the Char B-1 and Saumur S-35, but they fought alone. No communication, no coordination, and no air support. Their tanks were powerful but blind. Once surrounded, they were picked off one by one. Communication was one of the deadliest weaknesses. Early tanks didn't have radios, or if they did, only the commander's tank was equipped with one. Orders were given through hand signals or colored flags, useless in the chaos of combat. German crews, by contrast, had radios in every tank, which allowed them to move as a single fast-reacting unit. This advantage was devastating. Allied tanks often entered battle unaware of flanking movements or enemy ambushes. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already over. Dozens of tanks would burn before a single German was hit. Crew training was another fatal factor. Wartime pressure meant that thousands of men were being rushed into tanks after only minimal instruction. Many didn't fully understand their vehicle's vulnerabilities, where the armor was thinnest, how to angle the hull, or even how to escape quickly in an emergency. During Operation Barbarossa, Soviet conscripts were sent into combat after just 1 or 2 days of classroom lessons. Some had never even driven the tank they were assigned to. The results were catastrophic. German anti-tank guns shredded Soviet armor columns with ease, and the wrecks often piled up so thick that the next wave of tanks had to climb over them to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, the weapons designed to destroy tanks were evolving faster than the tanks themselves. By 1943, shape-charge technology had changed everything. Handheld weapons like the Panzerfaust or bazooka could punch through armor several inches thick. A tank that once could withstand small-caliber fire was now vulnerable to a single infantryman hiding behind a wall. Later, air power added another threat. Dive bombers and rocket-equipped planes could spot and destroy tanks from above, where their armor was weakest. The battlefield had become a death zone for any vehicle too slow to react. Inside the tank, the mental toll was immense. Crews were sealed in darkness with limited visibility through small slits or periscopes. The sound of the engine drowned out everything else. You never heard the shell that killed you. Veterans described hearing a sharp metallic clang, then instant silence. The lights would go out, smoke would fill the compartment, and the screaming would start. There was no way to prepare for that. Once you experienced it, it stayed with you forever. The psychological trauma created another grim statistic. A large percentage of surviving tankers refused to go back inside. Many suffered severe claustrophobia, tremors, and what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. But in wartime, there was no understanding of trauma. You either climbed back in or faced punishment for cowardice. So they went back, knowing full well that every battle was a coin toss between survival and being burned alive inside their machine. By 1944, the technology race between armor and firepower had reached its peak. Tanks got heavier, guns got larger, but survivability barely improved. For most crews, the first hit was the last. By the end of World War II, nations finally began to realize that tanks weren't just about armor and firepower. Survivability mattered just as much. The statistics were undeniable. Across every front, tank crews had the shortest life expectancy of any combat role. In the German army, the average survival rate for a Panzer crewman during the late war was estimated at less than 2 months. For Soviet crews, it was even shorter. American tankers who landed in Normandy faced casualty rates so high that replacements were constantly rotated in before they'd even finished proper training. The war had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Armor would never outpace firepower for long. Every time a new tank appeared, the enemy developed a gun or shell that could destroy it. By the time crews climbed into their vehicles, anti-tank technology had already caught up. It became a constant cycle of innovation and tragedy. After the war, militaries began studying why so few crews survived. Engineers tore apart wrecks from Europe and North Africa, documenting where hits occurred, how the fires spread, and what could have been done differently. One of the first lessons was ammunition storage. In future designs, shells were moved away from the crew compartment or placed inside armored bins with blow-off panels, engineered sections that vented explosions outward instead of inward. This simple change drastically increased survival rates. The British Centurion, the American M26 Pershing, and later the M60 all incorporated safer ammunition racks and better fire suppression systems. The Soviets developed automatic extinguishers and began installing anti-spall liners, interior padding that caught shrapnel instead of letting it ricochet around the cabin. But even with these improvements, tanking remained one of the most dangerous jobs in modern warfare. The crew still operated inside a confined space with hundreds of liters of fuel and high explosive shells only inches away. The Cold War brought even deadlier weapons: high-velocity cannons, shape-charge warheads, and later, depleted uranium rounds could destroy any tank on impact. Crews depended on new technologies like reactive armor, blocks of explosives that detonated outward to deflect incoming jets of molten metal. It was effective but terrifying. Your own tank was partially exploding by design. The margin between protection and death was still razor-thin. Modern tanks like the American M1 Abrams or the Russian T-90 were designed with the lessons of the past burned into their blueprints. The Abrams crew sits inside a sealed compartment with armored blast doors separating them from ammunition. The engine runs on jet fuel, but its design minimizes ignition risk. The addition of advanced optics and thermal sensors means crews no longer have to rely on narrow periscopes, reducing surprise attacks. In training, modern tankers are taught first and foremost how to survive a hit, something their World War II predecessors were never given the chance to learn. But the legacy of those early crews still defines armored warfare. Survivability became an engineering obsession because of them. Because for decades, tanks were death traps that demanded unimaginable courage. The statistic, 80% dying in their first battle, wasn't just a number. It was the reality faced by tens of thousands of men who climbed into metal coffins, knowing full well what waited for them once the first shell hit. Even today, inside the most advanced tanks in the world, crews still talk about that fear. The sound of the first impact, the flash of light, the split second of silence before the compartment fills with smoke. It's the same moment their grandfathers described 80 years ago. Technology has changed everything, except what it means to be inside that machine when it's hit. And that's why the statistic still matters. It reminds us that armored warfare, for all its power and precision, has always demanded something beyond bravery. The willingness to face a battlefield where survival was never guaranteed.